The spear hit the Veil perimeter at a speed that turned space itself into a blur, and the dying started immediately. The first ship was a Thyrasi cruiser on the left flank that took a direct hit from a Veil hive ship and broke apart in a shower of burning metal. The crew had no time to react, no time to send a final message, no time to do anything except cease to exist in a flash of white light. The second was a human destroyer that veered into the path of a Veil ram ship to protect the ships behind it. The collision was violent and brief, and when it was over, both vessels were gone. Behind the spear, the diversionary force was tearing into the main Veil swarm with everything they had. 760 ships against thousands of Veil, and they fought with a fury that went beyond tactics or strategy, or any rational calculation. They fought because 40 ships were counting on them to keep the swarm busy, and that was reason enough. The cost was staggering. Were dying by the dozens every minute. Captains who had served for decades made their last stands in the burning corridors of their vessels. Crews who had never imagined they would die in a place this far from home held their positions and kept firing until there was nothing left to fire. Back in the spear, the formation was shrinking. 12 ships gone in the first 3 minutes, then 16, then 20. The Veil were converging from every direction, sensing that these 40 ships were heading somewhere important, even if the swarm could not yet understand where. Every ship that fell tried to take Veil with it, firing until its weapons were empty, and then using its own hull as a battering ram. A Sarani phase cruiser phased through a wall of Veil fighters and materialized directly inside a hive ship, destroying both vessels in a matter-energy reaction that lit up the rift for 1,000 kilometers. The second Sarani cruiser used the explosion as cover to phase ahead. The remaining ship's precious seconds. 22 ships gone, 26 gone, 30 gone. The Kelvori carrier that had been selected for the spear released its entire drone reserve in a single massive burst, creating a cloud of metal and fire that shielded the surviving ships for nearly a full minute. When the drones were spent, the carrier turned broadside to the incoming Veil and absorbed impacts that would have destroyed the smaller ships behind it. Its captain, a Kelvori hive commander who had never spoken a word to a human before this battle, sent a single message on the fleet channel before the carrier broke apart. For the ones behind us, 34 ships gone. By the time the spear reached the inner perimeter of the Nexus defense zone, only 6 ships remained. 4 human frigates, including the Defiant Whisper, 1 Kelvori carrier that was barely more than a flying skeleton of structural beams, and 1 Sarani phase cruiser running on emergency. Power. And there it was. The Nexus organism filled the viewport like a nightmare made solid. It was the size of a small moon, a vast pulsing mass of dark organic matter laced with bioluminescent neural pathways that flickered in patterns too complex for any computer to fully map. It was growing even as they watched, sprouting new defensive structures from its surface, generating point defense organisms that began firing at the approaching ships. Tendrils of living matter reached out into space like grasping fingers. It was alive in a way that was deeply and fundamentally wrong. A brain the size of a world, thinking thoughts that no other form of life was ever meant to think. Marin stared at it through the viewport of the Defiant Whisper, and felt something cold settle in her chest. She had known since she volunteered for the spear that she was probably not going home. She had made her peace with that in the quiet hours before the assault. About the people she loved and the sky she would never see again. But peace was one thing, and seeing the thing that was going to kill you was another. She pushed the feeling down and locked it away, because there was work to do. All surviving ships, she said, her voice steady and clear. Target the Nexus. Fire everything you have. Every missile, every slug, every charge. If it can kill, put it on target. We do not stop until this thing is dead, or we are. The 6 ships opened fire simultaneously, and the Nexus shuddered. Missiles slammed into its surface and detonated, tearing craters in the dark flesh that immediately began to heal. Kinetic slugs punched through layers of chitin and membrane, reaching deeper structures that pulsed and bled luminescent fluid. The point defense organisms on the surface fired back, and 2 of the human frigates took hits that crippled their weapon systems. But they kept firing. The Kelvori carrier, its structure failing, hull buckling, accelerated on a collision course with the Nexus. It hit the surface at tremendous speed and drove deep into the organism's outer shell, carving a massive cavity that exposed the glowing neural networks beneath. The carrier's reactor detonated inside the wound, and the explosion blew a hole in the Nexus the size of a city. The Sarani phase cruiser saw the opening and made a decision that its captain had been preparing for since the spear launched. It flew directly into the breach and activated its phase drive, not to escape, but to destabilize it. A phase drive pushed into overload inside a living organism created a spatial rupture, a tear in the fabric of reality that expanded outward and shredded everything it touched. The Sarani ship ceased to exist, and the wound in the Nexus doubled in size. Neural pathways across the organism's surface began to flicker and die. The Nexus was screaming, if something that vast could scream, sending distress signals on. Frequencies that made every sensor on the surviving ships shriek in protest. But it was not dead, not yet. The wound was closing. The Nexus was healing. Marin looked at the tactical display. 2 human frigates were still firing, but their weapons were nearly spent. The Nexus would regenerate within minutes. She looked at the breach in the Nexus, the massive wound that led to its core. She looked at the Defiant Whisper's reactor readout. She did the math. It was very simple math. All surviving ships, she said, break off and withdraw at maximum speed. The 2 frigates hesitated. That is an order, Marin said. Get clear, now. They obeyed because her voice left no room for argument. Marin turned to her bridge crew. There were 11 of them. The original complement had been 46. The rest were dead or in the sealed-off sections of the ship that no longer had atmosphere. I am going to fly this ship into the breach and detonate the reactor at the Nexus core, she said. Anyone who wants to reach the escape pods has 90 seconds. I will not think less of anyone who goes. No one moved. Her helmsman, a young man named Torres who had joined the Navy because he wanted to see the stars, looked at her and said, "Where you go, we go, Captain." Her weapons officer nodded. Her engineer crossed her arms. Her communications tech adjusted his headset as if preparing for just another day. Marin felt her throat tighten. She blinked once hard, and then she smiled. "Then let us finish this." The Defiant Whisper accelerated into the breach. Its hull scraped against the walls of living tissue. The ship shook so violently that Marin had to grip her chair to stay seated. Bioluminescent fluid splashed across the viewport, turning the world into a wash of cold blue light. They went deeper. The neural pathways of the Nexus surrounded them, vast glowing conduits carrying the thoughts of an intelligence that spanned millions of ships. They were inside the mind of the swarm, and the mind was aware of them. The core was ahead, a blazing knot of light so bright that Marin had to shield her eyes. "Reactor overload initiated," her engineer reported, her voice calm and professional to the very end. "Detonation in 15 seconds. Marin closed her eyes. She thought of Earth. She thought of blue sky and green grass and the sound of rain. She thought of Admiral Rourke, standing on the bridge of his flagship, watching her fly away. She thought of everyone who had ever been told they were not enough and had proved the universe wrong. 14, 13, 12. She opened her eyes. "For all of us," she said. The Defiant Whisper detonated at the heart of the Nexus organism, and for one brief instant, the Ashen Veil rift was filled with light. The Nexus died in a cascade that was visible from light minutes away. Neural pathways went dark in waves, spreading outward from the core. In water. The massive organism shuddered, split, and began to come apart, continent-sized pieces of dead flesh tumbling into the gravitational currents of the rift. Small to believe. 18 ships emerged from the Ashen Veil rift. 7 human ships, including Admiral Rourke's battered flagship, with its hull scarred and its port side half-melted by radiation. 4 Thyrassi cruisers that had abandoned their own doctrine and fought the human way. 3 Kelvori scout ships running on emergency power. 2 Sorani frigates whose phase drives would never function again. 1 Drelith medical vessel that had spent the entire battle pulling survivors from the wreckage while under fire. 1 ship that had no official designation because it had been cobbled together mid-battle from the fused remains of 3 different vessels crewed by members of 5 different species who had simply refused to stop fighting. 18 ships out of 9,900. Commander Asha Marin was not among the survivors. The Defiant Whisper was gone. There was nothing left of it, not debris, not wreckage, not even a trace. It had been consumed entirely in the detonation that killed the Nexus. In the weeks that followed, the Galactic Concord was forced to reckon with what had happened. The great fleets of the elder species, built over millennia of unchallenged dominance, had been shattered by an enemy they could not adapt to. And the species that had saved them, that had turned the tide and found a way to win when winning seemed impossible, was the one they had dismissed as insignificant. Humanity was not the strongest species. They were not the most advanced. Their ships were not the biggest or the most powerful. But they possessed something that no elder species had ever developed, because no elder species had ever needed it. They knew how to lose. They knew how to be beaten and broken and driven to the edge of extinction and then get back up. They knew how to fight without a playbook, to improvise when every plan had failed, to make death expensive when survival was no longer an option. Spent 10,000 years doing them to each other. And every scar from that violent history had become a lesson that the galaxy desperately needed. Liaison Orith stood before the full assembly of the Galactic Concord, the same chamber where Fleet Marshal Sorvale had declared his grand crusade, and delivered testimony that would be studied for centuries. We brought 9,900 ships, and the pride of a dozen civilizations, he said. The humans brought 214 ships, and something none of us possessed, the memory of what it means to lose everything and still fight for tomorrow. We called them a lesser species. We were fools. 3 months after the battle, Admiral Kalen Rourke stood before a memorial wall on Earth. The wall was made of dark stone, polished until it reflected the faces of those who stood before it, and it was covered from end to end with names. Thousands of names, human names that would never be spoken again by the people who bore. He found Marin's name near the center of the wall. He placed his hand against the cool stone and stood there for a long time. He did not speak. He did not need to. Behind him, in a long silent line, ambassadors from every surviving species in the Galactic Concord had come to pay their respects. For the first time in galactic history, non-human flags flew at half-mast for human dead. It was a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year ago, and was now the least that anyone could do. The inscription at the base of the memorial had been chosen by Rourke himself. It did not speak of victory or glory or the grand destiny of humanity. It said something simpler and truer. We were not the finest. We were not the mightiest. We were simply the ones who refused to stop. A probationary species no more. Oruth stood at the back of the gathering and watched the human admiral press his hand to the name of the woman who had killed a god with a dying ship. Pretend to fully understand humanity. He doubted anyone ever would. But he understood one thing with perfect clarity. The galaxy had looked at these small, stubborn creatures and seen nothing worth fearing. The galaxy had been wrong. 72 hours had passed since the fleet entered the Ashen Veil rift, and the numbers told a story that no one wanted to hear. Of the 9,900 ships that had assembled with such pride and certainty, fewer than 800 remained operational. Wreckage filled the rift in every direction, the shattered husks of once magnificent warships drifting alongside the dark carcasses of dead Veil bioships. The gravitational anomalies of the rift pulled the debris into slow spiraling currents, so that the battlefield looked like a graveyard caught in a whirlpool. Of humanity's 214 ships, only 31 were still fighting. Admiral Rourke had not slept in 2 days. His eyes were rimmed with red, and his uniform was creased and stained with coffee. But his voice remained steady, and his mind remained sharp. He stood at the center of his bridge, surrounded by holographic displays that showed the positions of every surviving ship and every known Veil concentration. The problem was simple and terrible. The Veil had lost tens of thousands of bioships to the Coalition assault, but it did not matter, because they were regenerating. They consumed the wreckage of destroyed ships, both their own and Coalition vessels, breaking down the materials and growing new bioships from the debris. The swarm was wounded, but it was healing faster than the Coalition could hurt it. "We cannot win this through attrition," Rourke said to the assembled commanders who were attending via holographic link from their own battered ships. "We kill 1,000 of them, and they grow back 500 from the wreckage. We are feeding the enemy with our own dead." The silence that followed was heavy with despair. Commander Marin spoke from the defiant whisper, which was held together at this point by emergency welds and the stubborn refusal of its engineering crew to let it die. "Then we need to stop fighting the swarm and start fighting whatever controls it." Rourke nodded, because Marin had arrived at the same conclusion he had reached hours ago. Deep scans conducted during the battle had revealed something hidden behind the densest concentration of Veil ships at the far end of the rift. It was massive, roughly the size of a small moon, and it was alive. It pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that matched the communication signals flowing between Veil ships. Rourke's science officers had identified it as the Nexus organism, the central brain of the entire swarm intelligence. Every Veil ship in the rift was connected to this Nexus. Every adaptation, every tactical shift, every coordinated movement flowed from it like thoughts from a mind. If the Nexus was destroyed, the swarm would not merely lose coordination, it would lose sentience entirely. The individual bioships would revert to mindless animals driven by instinct rather than intelligence. The problem was reaching it. The Nexus sat behind a wall of approximately 8,000 Veil ships in the most violent and unstable region of the rift. Gravitational anomalies in that area were strong enough to tear an unshielded ship apart, and radiation levels were lethal within minutes, even with full protection. A conventional fleet assault would require thousands of ships they did not have. "We do not need a fleet," Rourke said. "We need a spear." He laid out the plan and called it Operation Hearthfire. 40 ships, the fastest and toughest survivors in the fleet, would form a strike group and make a direct run through the Veil line to reach the Nexus. They would not fight their way through in any conventional sense. They would punch through at maximum speed, using the chaos of battle as cover, and they would not stop for anything until they reached the target. The remaining 760 Coalition ships would launch a massive diversionary attack on the main Veil formation, drawing as many ships as possible away. From the Nexus corridor, the diversion would be brutal and it would be costly. The ships committed to it would likely not survive. Every captain who volunteered for the spear understood what they were signing up for. The odds of reaching the Nexus were small. The odds of surviving after reaching it were smaller. Rourke selected the 40 ships personally. Most of them were human, because the human ships were the fastest, and because the humans had proven they knew how to fly through hell and come out the other side. He also included a Kelvori carrier that still had a functioning drone bay, 2 Sarani phase cruisers whose drives had been repaired under fire, and a handful of Thraci cruisers whose captains had abandoned their species' rigid doctrine and learned to fight the human way. When the selections were announced, Commander Marin immediately volunteered the Defiant Whisper. Rourke called her on a private channel. "Your ship is barely holding together," he said. "Half your decks are open to vacuum. Your port engine is dead. You have more patches than hull plating. And she is still the fastest ship in this fleet," Marin replied. "You know that. We ran the numbers. The Whisper can outrun anything the Veil have. She is the best chance the Spear has of actually reaching the Nexus." Rourke was quiet for a long time. "Asha," he said, and the use of her first name told her more than any order could. "I know," she said softly. "I know what this is, and I am volunteering anyway, because someone has to be first through the door, and it might as well be someone who knows how to kick it open." He let out a slow breath. "Confirmed. Defiant Whisper is assigned to the Spear. Lead position." "Understood, Admiral," Asha replied. There was a pause. "Give them hell," Rourke said. "That was always the plan." The night before the assault, something happened that none of the surviving officers had expected or planned. The Thraci cruiser whose captain had fought alongside human wolf packs for 2 days and watched human crews sacrifice themselves to protect ships that were not their own. He ordered his crew to paint a symbol on the hull of his ship, a crude reproduction of an old Earth military insignia that he had seen on the side of a human frigate. He did not know what it meant exactly. He only knew that it belonged to the people who had saved his crew 3 times. Within hours, it spread. Across the surviving fleet, on ships of every species, crews began painting human symbols on their hulls. Kelvori workers used industrial adhesive to spell out words in Terran Standard that they could not pronounce. Sarani energy beings reshaped small portions of their ship's outer plating into patterns that mimicked human flags. A Draelith medical vessel, whose crew had treated wounded from every species, painted a single word across its bow in letters 10 meters tall: Defiance. Corridors of Rourke's flagship, and watched human crew members stop and stare at the reports coming in from other ships. He saw hardened soldiers wipe their eyes and turn away. He saw officers who had not smiled in 3 days laugh with something that was not quite joy, but was close to it. He would later write that this was the moment the galaxy stopped seeing humanity as a lesser species. Not when the humans fought and died with impossible courage, but when every other species in the fleet chose to honor them for it. Rourke saw the reports too, and for the first time since the battle began, the steady calm in his eyes flickered with something that might have been emotion. He blinked it away quickly, because there was still work to do. The fleet assembled for the final assault. The 40 ships of the Spear formed up in a tight arrowhead formation, with the Defiant Whisper at its tip. Behind them, the 760 ships of the Diversionary Force spread into a wide, aggressive formation designed to look like a full fleet assault. Rourke addressed every ship on every frequency. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "I will not promise you victory. I will not promise you survival. I will only promise you this. Whatever happens in the next few hours, the galaxy will remember that we, all of us, did not go quietly. That is enough. That has always been enough." He paused. "Spear Group, you are cleared to launch. Diversionary Force, begin your attack. All ships, all species, for everyone we have lost, and everyone who is counting on us." The Diversionary Force surged forward, and the Veil swarm rose to meet them. The sky lit up with weapons fire, and the dying began again. And in the shadow of that carnage, 40 small ships accelerated to maximum speed and dove into the heart of the rift, heading for the thing that held the swarm together. Marin sat in her command chair and watched the Veil line rushing toward her through the viewport. The Defiant Whisper shook and groaned around her, a ship that by all rights should have been in a repair dock, rather than leading a charge into the most dangerous place in the galaxy. She placed her hand flat on the console beside her, and felt the vibration of the engines through her palm. "All right, old girl," she whispered. "One more run." The spear hit the Veil line, and the darkness swallowed them whole. The Veil's swarm intelligence had consumed 3 civilizations before it reached the Galactic Concord. It had learned to counter energy weapons within hours of first encountering them. It had decoded the Serani phase drives in less than a day. It had broken the Kelvori drone command network in minutes. It took the swarm intelligence approximately 11 seconds to realize that the 214 small ships now tearing into its ranks were something entirely different. It took much longer than that to understand why it could not stop them. Protocol Ember was not a single tactic or a clever trick or a secret weapon. It was the distilled essence of 10,000 years of human conflict. Every dirty trick, every desperate gamble, every act of savage creativity that humanity had ever used to survive against enemies that should have destroyed them. It was a library of war written in blood and passed down through generations, not as pride, but as necessity. And it activated in 3 stages. Ember 1 was called Fog. Every human ship began broadcasting electronic warfare interference on a scale that the Veil had never encountered before. The battlespace was suddenly flooded with phantom signals, ghost ships that appeared on sensors and then vanished, false thermal signatures that looked like reactor cores about to explode, decoy transmissions that mimicked the communication patterns of Tharasi and Kelvori and Sorani ships. The Veil's swarm intelligence processed information from the battlefield to coordinate its attacks, and suddenly, the information it was receiving was mostly lies. The swarm stuttered. Ships that had been moving in perfect coordination hesitated, corrected, hesitated again. Attack runs were aborted because the targets disappeared mid-approach. Veil formations split to engage phantom fleets that did not exist, leaving real gaps in their defensive lines. It was not enough to stop the Veil, but it was enough to confuse them, and confusion was something the swarm had never experienced before. Ember 2 was called Fracture. The human ships abandoned every conventional formation that the Veil might have learned to predict. Instead, they broke apart into wolf packs of 3 to 5 ships each. Every wolf pack operated independently, making its own decisions, choosing its own targets, fighting in its own way. There was no central doctrine for the Veil to decode, because there was no central doctrine at all. One wolf pack used the gravitational anomalies of the rift as cover, hiding behind folds in space and ambushing Veil clusters as they passed. Another lured a group of Veil fighters into a narrow corridor between 2 radiation storms and then hit them from both sides in a crossfire that left nothing alive. A third pack used their own damaged drone shuttles as bait, ejecting them with active transponders, and then destroying the Veil ships that came to investigate. Differently, because every captain fought differently. The Veil swarm intelligence tried to find the pattern, the underlying logic, the doctrine it could study and counter. But the pattern was that there was no pattern. The logic was that each human crew was improvising, adapting, making it up as they went along, drawing on instincts that had been shaped by millennia of fighting enemies who fought and adapted just as quickly. The Veil could not counter creativity. It could not predict unpredictability. It could not build a model of an enemy that refused to be modeled. Ember 3 was called Spite. This was the part that broke the Veil's ability to calculate risk. When a human ship was damaged beyond the ability to fight, it did not retreat. It did not surrender. It accelerated directly into the nearest concentration of Veil ships and detonated its reactor. Every dying human ship became a bomb. The Veil had fought species that fled when damaged, like this, surrendered when outmatched. Species that followed logical patterns of self-preservation, that the swarm could predict and exploit. They had never fought a species that made death itself into a weapon, that looked at a hopeless situation and decided that if they were going to die, they were going to make it cost the enemy as much as possible. The calculus of the battle changed. The Veil could no longer simply damage human ships and move on, because a damaged human ship was more dangerous than a healthy one. The swarm had to either destroy them completely or avoid them entirely, and both options cost time and resources that the Veil could not afford. The effect on the larger battle was immediate. Surviving coalition ships that had been fighting alone and failing began to notice that the Veil pressure was easing around the human wolf packs. Captains who had been preparing for death saw openings they had not expected. Cavalry carriers that still had functioning drone bays moved toward the human formations and launched fresh swarms under the cover of human electronic warfare. Serrani phase cruisers that had been too afraid to phase after the Veil cracked their frequencies found that the fog interference was masking their phase signatures enough to slip through safely. Even the Thyrasi began to adapt. 3 cruiser captains, defying every tradition of their warrior culture, broke formation and fell in with human wolf packs. They fought alongside the humans, following their lead, and for the first time in the battle, the Thyrasi ships were not losing. The tide was not turning, not yet, but it had stopped flowing in one direction. Commander Marin led her wolf pack with a ferocity that would become legendary in the years that followed. The Defiant Whisper was a frigate designed for scouting and escort duty, not frontline combat, but Marin flew it like a blade. She wove through Veil formations at speeds that made her helmsman pray to gods he did not believe in, striking at weak points and vanishing before the swarm could respond. Her wolf pack identified what appeared to be a Veil coordination node, a massive bioship that pulsed with neural light and seemed to direct the movements of several thousand ships in its sector. 4 human frigates against a target the size of a small city. Marin did not hesitate. She ordered her pack to attack from 4 different vectors simultaneously, each ship hitting the node from a different angle, at a different time, with different weapons. The node's defenses could not track all 4 threats at once, and the wolf pack tore it apart in a savage 90-second assault. When the coordination node died, every Veil ship in that sector went briefly feral, attacking randomly or flying in confused circles without direction. It lasted only minutes before the greater swarm intelligence reasserted control. But in those minutes, hundreds of Veil ships were destroyed by coalition forces that seized the opportunity. The Defiant Whisper limped away from the engagement, venting atmosphere from half its decks, with one engine dead, and its hull scored by dozens of impacts. Marin herself had a cut across her forehead that she ignored, because there were more important things to worry about. Across the fleet, the humans were paying a terrible price for their effectiveness. They were small ships fighting far above their weight class, and no amount of cunning could entirely compensate for the difference in firepower and armor. Ships were dying, wolf packs were being whittled down, and every reactor detonation that took a cluster of Veil with it also meant a human crew that would never go home. But the humans did not stop, and the galaxy was watching. On the bridge of Rourke's flagship, Orith stood perfectly still, his compound eyes taking in the tactical display. His antennae had stopped trembling. The bitter chemical smell of panic had been replaced by something else. Something his species had no word for, because they had never needed one. He was watching a species that had been dismissed as irrelevant throw itself into the fire to save civilizations that had never shown them an ounce of respect. And he was watching it work. The moment that changed everything came 6 hours into the human engagement. A Veil strike force broke through the outer lines and headed straight for Fleet Marshal Sorveil's flagship. The throne of Keth was surrounded, and its escorts were overwhelmed. Sorveil ordered his crew to fight to the last. 3 human frigates, the last surviving members of a wolf pack that had started with 5, threw themselves into the path of the Veil strike force. They bought the Tharasi flagship 45 seconds of breathing room. It was not enough. The throne of Keth was breached, and Fleet Marshal Sorvale died on his bridge, still giving orders, still refusing to believe that his doctrine had failed him. Death. The coalition command structure shattered. The surviving fleet had no supreme commander, no chain of authority, no unified plan. Species that had been rivals for millennia had no protocol for working together without a hierarchy to enforce it. The battle was about to become a rout. Then Orath did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He walked to the communications console on Rourke's bridge, opened a channel on all coalition frequencies, and spoke in a voice that carried to every surviving ship in the fleet. All ships, all species. Human Admiral Rourke has tactical command. Follow the humans. They know how to survive this. There was silence on every frequency for exactly 4 seconds. Then one by one the surviving ships of a dozen species acknowledged the order. And the war entered its next phase. The Ashen Veil rift was a place that felt wrong, in a way that went beyond what instruments could measure. Space itself seemed bruised here, twisted into shapes that hurt the mind if you stared at them too long. Gravitational currents pulled at the fleet like invisible hands, and radiation storms bloomed without warning, lighting up the darkness in shades of sickly green and violet. The stars outside the rift were hidden, as if the galaxy itself did not want to watch what was about to happen. The coalition fleet moved through this nightmare in perfect formation, 9,900 ships, arranged in a crescent so vast that light took seconds to cross from one end to the other. Fleet Marshal Sorvale commanded from the bridge of his flagship, the Throne of Keth, a Thyrasi dreadnought so heavily armored that it could survive a direct hit from a small moon. His officers moved around him with the practiced calm of warriors who had never lost a battle. The Veil met them on the 3rd day. They came from every direction at once, pouring out of the twisted folds of the rift like blood from a wound. Intelligence had estimated their numbers at around 15,000 ships. The actual count was closer to 40,000. They were horrible to look at, each one a living thing of dark chitin and pulsing membranes, grown rather than built. They ranged in size from fighters no bigger than a shuttle, to massive hive ships that dwarfed even the Tharasi dreadnoughts. And they moved with a unity that was terrifying. Tens of thousands of ships acting as one organism, wheeling and diving and attacking with the precision of a single mind. Because that is exactly what they were. The first hours of the battle were magnificent in a terrible way. The coalition fleet opened fire with everything it had. Tharasi dreadnoughts unleashed walls of plasma that turned whole sections of space into burning oceans. Kelvori carriers released clouds of combat drones that swarmed the Veil fighters in buzzing metallic storms. Sarani phase cruisers slipped in and out of normal space, striking from impossible angles and vanishing before the enemy could respond. Ripped the Sarani ships out of phase space mid-transition. The effect was catastrophic. Ships materialized half inside Veil bioships, or partially merged with asteroids, or simply came apart because their structural integrity failed during an interrupted phase shift. 300 Sarani cruisers were destroyed in less than an hour. The Kelvori were next. Their combat drones were devastating in number, but the Veil began broadcasting signals that mimicked the Kelvori command frequencies. The drones became confused, turning on each other or flying in useless circles, while Veil fighters tore through the now defenseless carriers. One by one, the great carrier hives went dark. Their drone swarms turned into clouds of harmless debris. The Thyrasi held the longest because their strategy was the simplest: overwhelming firepower delivered in rigid, disciplined formations. But rigidity was exactly what the Veil exploited. The swarm intelligence mapped the Thyrasi firing patterns and found the gaps between salvos, the blind spots in their formation geometry, the predictable timing of their shield rotations. Veil ships poured through these gaps, like water through cracks in a dam, and the great dreadnoughts began to die. Fleet Marshal Sorvale responded the only way he knew how. He ordered his ships to tighten formation and increase firepower. It was the Thyrassi answer to every problem. More force, more discipline, more of the same. It did not work. From the rear of the fleet, Admiral Rourke watched the disaster unfold on his tactical display. Each red dot that vanished represented a ship and its crew, hundreds or thousands of lives blinking out of existence. The display was becoming emptier by the minute. Commander Marin stood beside him, her face pale, but her eyes sharp. "They are adapting to everything," she said. "Every tactic the elder species use, the Veil counter it within minutes." Rourke nodded slowly. He had been watching the patterns of adaptation, the way the swarm learned and shifted, and he recognized something in it that made his blood run cold. "They learn the way a predator learns," he said. "They watch what you do, and they find the weakness in it. Every species in this fleet fights according to doctrine, a set of rules that tells them how to behave in battle. The Thyrassi doctrine says hold formation and deliver maximum firepower. The Sarani doctrine says phase and strike. The Kelvori doctrine says overwhelm with numbers." He paused. "The Veil are not fighting our ships. They are fighting our doctrines. And doctrines are predictable." Marin looked at him. "And Protocol Ember has no doctrine," Rourke said. "That is the point." He opened a channel to Fleet Marshal Sorvale and requested permission to reposition the human contingent from the rear logistics line to the forward combat zone. Sorvale's response was immediate and dismissive. "Denied. You will hold your position and stay out of the way. Your little ships would be destroyed in seconds." Rourke closed the channel and was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened a channel to all 214 human ships. "All ships, this is Admiral Rourke. We are moving to the front. Activate Protocol Ember on my mark." Marin stared at him. He denied the request. He did. "You are disobeying a direct order from the Supreme Commander of the Coalition Fleet." "I am." Marin considered this for about 1 second, then turned to her helmsman and began issuing navigation orders. Liaison Orath, who had been watching the battle with growing horror from the observation deck, rushed to the bridge when he felt the ship change course. His antennae were vibrating with distress, and the chemical signals he was releasing filled the air with a bitter smell that the human crew had learned to associate with panic. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "You cannot advance. The Marshal has ordered you to remain in position. You are logistics support. You are." He stopped because he had looked at the tactical display and seen what Rourke had seen. The Coalition fleet was dying. 6,000 ships were already gone, and the rate of destruction was accelerating. The Grand Crescent formation had collapsed into a chaotic mess of isolated groups fighting desperately and failing. "We are the only ones who can help them," Rourke said, without turning around. "You have 200 ships against 40,000, Oroth said. "You are sending your people to die." Rourke finally turned to look at the Kelvori diplomat, and Oroth saw something in those steady human eyes that he had never seen in any species before. It was not bravery exactly, it was something older and harder, the look of a creature that had stared into the abyss so many times that it had stopped being afraid of the dark. "No," Rourke said. "I am sending them to do what we have always done. Fight ugly, fight dirty, and refuse to die on someone else's terms." He turned back to the display. "All ships. Protocol Ember is active. Weapons free. Formation break on my signal. You know what to do." 214 human ships surged forward out of the logistics line and into the burning heart of the battle. They were small and rough and insignificant next to the dying giants of the elder fleets. But they were not afraid, and they were not predictable. Across the human fleet, captains and crews who had trained for this moment without ever truly believing it would come, felt something settle into their bones. It was not confidence exactly. It was something more dangerous. It was the cold, clear fury of a species that had been underestimated for the last time. Marin gripped the arms of her command chair as the defiant whisper accelerated toward a wall of Veil bioships. "All wolf packs," she said into the fleet channel. "Weapons hot and minds sharp. We fight our way, and no one else's." The first human ships hit the Veil line, and the swarm intelligence that had dismantled every elder species doctrine in the galaxy encountered something it had never processed before. Chaos with a purpose. And for the first time since the battle began, the Veil hesitated. The galaxy had never been kind to newcomers, and humanity learned that lesson the hard way. 60 years ago, when the first human ships crossed into the wider galaxy, they were met not with wonder, but with cold indifference. The Galactic Concord, an alliance of 14 ancient species that had ruled the stars for thousands of years, looked at humanity the way a man might look at an insect crawling across his table. They were tolerated but never respected. They were given a seat at the table but never allowed to speak. Humanity was classified as a probationary species, which was a polite way of saying they were considered barely worth noticing. Their technology was generations behind the elder races. Their fleet was small. Their history was short by galactic standards. The Thyrasi, a proud reptilian race who had conquered star systems before humans had learned to make fire, openly called them the children. The Sarani, beings of light and energy who could phase through solid objects, saw humanity as no more than a curiosity. Matter ignored them entirely. The Kelvori, a vast insectoid civilization that communicated through chemical signals and shared consciousness, found them confusing and distasteful. And so for 60 years, humanity existed on the edges of galactic civilization, building quietly, learning quickly, and swallowing their pride because they had no other choice. Then the Veil came. The Ashen Veil rift was a wound in the fabric of space at the far edge of the galaxy, a corridor of twisted gravity and violent radiation that no sane species would approach. It had been sealed and monitored for centuries, considered a curiosity and nothing more. But one morning the monitoring stations went silent, and by the time a scout fleet arrived to investigate, there was nothing left. The Veil Dominion poured through the rift like a flood of living darkness. They were not a species in any way the galaxy understood. They were a swarm, a single vast intelligence spread across millions of miles. Bioorganic ships that fought and moved and killed as one. They consumed everything in their path, breaking down planets and moons and ships into raw material and using it to build more of themselves. 3 frontier worlds belonging to the elder species were devoured in the first month. Billions of lives vanished without a trace. For the first time in recorded galactic history, the Concord was afraid. An emergency summit was called on the Thyrasi throne world of Kef-Sorvan. Every species sent their leaders, their admirals, their greatest military minds. The chamber was vast and ancient, carved from a single mountain, and filled with the holographic projections of burning worlds. The mood was grim. Fleet Marshal Thien Sorvale of the Thyrasi took command because that was what the Thyrasi always did. He was tall even by the standards of his kind, with scales the color of burnished gold, and eyes that held the absolute certainty of someone who had never been proven wrong. Stood before the assembled leaders, and declared that the Concord would meet the Veil with the largest fleet ever assembled. 9,900 warships, drawn from every member species. The numbers were staggering. The Thyrasi contributed 2,000 dreadnoughts, each one a fortress of layered armor and devastating firepower. The Kelvori sent 1,500 carrier hives, buzzing with millions of combat drones. The Sarani deployed 800 phase cruisers that could slip between dimensions and strike from angles that should have been impossible. Every species gave what they could, and when the fleet was fully assembled, it stretched across space like a wall of steel and light. Humanity was asked to contribute, and the response from the other species, when the human contingent arrived, was barely concealed amusement. 214 ships. They were not dreadnoughts or carriers or phase cruisers. They were frigates and destroyers, vessels built for speed and endurance rather than raw power. They looked rough and utilitarian next to the gleaming warships of the elder races, like working trucks parked beside luxury vehicles. Fleet Marshal Sorvale assigned the humans to the rear logistics line, far from any real fighting. It was not a tactical decision. It was a dismissal. Admiral Kalen Rourke, commander of the human contingent, accepted the assignment without argument. He was a man in his late 50s, with gray at his temples, and calm, steady eyes that never seemed to blink at the wrong moment. He had fought in 3 border conflicts and 2 colonial rebellions, and he carried those experiences not as medals on his chest, but as weight behind his gaze. When Sorvale looked at Rourke, he saw a minor officer commanding a minor fleet from a minor species. He did not see what Rourke actually was. Commander Asha Marin, captain of the frigate Defiant Whisper, stood beside Rourke on the bridge of the human flag. As the fleet prepared to depart, she was younger than him by 20 years, sharp and quick, with a mind that could read a battlefield the way a musician reads a sheet of notes. She had been his student and was now his most trusted officer. She watched the massive Thyrassi dreadnoughts gliding past their position and shook her head. "They have put us behind the supply ships," she said, her voice flat with controlled anger. "Behind the medical transports. We might as well not be here." Rourke did not look up from his command console. "Good," he said. Marin frowned. "Good. If they do not expect anything from us, then they will not watch us, and if they do not watch us, then they will not ask questions about what we are preparing." He tapped a command sequence into his console, and across all 214 human ships, a single coded order was received and acknowledged. Load Protocol Ember. Marin had heard rumors about Ember, but she had never seen it. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "What exactly is Protocol Ember?" Rourke was quiet for a moment, watching the stars through the bridge viewport. The great fleet of the Galactic Concord stretched before them, magnificent and proud and utterly certain of its own power. "Every species in this fleet has fought wars," he said slowly. "The Thyrassi conquered their neighbors. The Sarani phased through every enemy that challenged them. The Kelvori swarmed over opposition with sheer numbers. They have always won. And because they have always won, they have never truly learned." He turned to look at her, and there was something old and heavy in his eyes. "Humanity is different. We have lost wars. We have been beaten and broken and driven to the edge of extinction, not by aliens, but by ourselves. We have fought each other with sticks and stones and nuclear fire and everything in between. We know what it means to face an enemy that adapts, that thinks, that refuses." He looked back at the fleet. Protocol Ember is not a weapon. It is every lesson our species has ever learned about survival, when everything goes wrong. It is 10,000 years of human war compressed into a set of tactical packages that no other species in this galaxy has ever needed to develop, because no other species has ever been desperate enough to think the way we think. Marin studied his face. "You believe this battle is going to go wrong?" "I believe," Rourke said quietly, "that these proud ancient civilizations have never fought anything like the Vial. And I believe that before this is over, they are going to need the one species in this galaxy that has spent its entire existence learning how to survive against impossible odds." The fleet entered the Ashen Veil Rift the next day, 9,900 ships moving in a grand crescent formation that was beautiful and terrible to behold. Liaison Orith, a Kelvori, diplomat assigned to observe the human contingent, stood on the bridge of Rourke's flagship and watched with all 6 of his compound eyes. He had been sent because no one important wanted the assignment. Babysitting the humans was considered a waste of a career. He would later write in his testimony to the Galactic Concord that as the fleet entered the rift, he felt the first stirring of something he could not name, a sensation that crawled along his antennae like static before a storm. He did not know it yet, but he was feeling the future change.